Leave, you're not welcome here anymore. This is my house and my family." My son-in-law, Mark, screamed at me during Thanksgiving dinner, his face red with rage over a simple comment I'd made about the election. I sat there in stunned silence, watching my 10-year-old grandson Jake's eyes fill with tears as his father threw his grandfather out of their home. That night, I made one phone call that would change their lives forever. If you've ever been disrespected by someone living off your generosity, if you've ever been told you're not welcome in a house you're paying for, grab your coffee and settle in, friend, because this old man just taught his family the most expensive lesson about gratitude they'll ever receive. Sometimes people need to lose everything to understand what they actually had. And if you're here for stories about standing up for yourself when family takes you for granted, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm Richard, and this is Grandpa's Diaries, where we talk about the moments that reveal people's true character. This story taught me that respect can't be bought, but the lack of it can certainly be expensive. That Thanksgiving dinner became the most costly meal Mark Parker ever ate, though he didn't know it yet. The man who told me to leave his house was about to discover exactly whose house it really was. By midnight, I'd frozen every account, canceled every card, and cut off every financial lifeline I'd been providing for years. The family that kicked me out was about to learn what independence really costs. The look of smug satisfaction on Mark's face as I gathered my coat told me everything I needed to know about years of quiet resentment. But what he didn't know, what none of them realized, was that the man they just humiliated was also the man keeping their entire lifestyle afloat. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply stopping your generosity and watching reality set in. I'd been supporting Susan and Mark's family for 8 years, ever since they got married and Mark's promising sales career needed some temporary help getting established. The $150,000 down payment for their house, the $2,400 monthly private school tuition for both kids, the car payments, insurance premiums, and countless other expenses had all been flowing from my accounts to theirs through a complex web of joint accounts and automatic transfers. That Thursday night, sitting alone in my study with my laptop open to my bank's website, I systematically dismantled the financial empire I'd built around their comfort. Every automatic payment stopped, every joint account froze, every credit card linked to my accounts got canceled. The family that had just rejected me was about to discover what their lifestyle actually cost when someone else wasn't paying for it. My relationship with Mark had always been complicated, but I'd tolerated his attitude because I loved Susan and wanted her to be happy. When they got engaged, Mark seemed like a decent enough young man with ambition and potential. He had a job in pharmaceutical sales and talked confidently about building a successful career. Susan was head over heels in love, and I wanted to give them every advantage possible as they started their life together. The financial support began innocently enough. Mark and Susan couldn't qualify for a mortgage without a substantial down payment, so I offered to help with $150,000 to get them into the house they wanted in a good school district. "It's an investment in my grandchildren's future," I told them, and I meant it. I wanted Emma and Jake to grow up in a safe neighborhood with excellent schools. When Emma was ready for kindergarten, Mark and Susan decided they wanted her in St. Catherine's Academy, the most prestigious private school in the area. The tuition was $12,000 per year, which strained their budget significantly. Rather than see my granddaughter miss out on excellent education, I offered to cover the school expenses. "Education is the best gift we can give our children," I said, remembering how my late wife Margaret always prioritized learning. The support gradually expanded as their lifestyle grew to match their neighborhood. Car payments when Mark decided he needed a luxury sedan for his sales image. Insurance premiums when they wanted comprehensive coverage. home maintenance costs when the house needed updates. Each request was presented as temporary assistance until Mark's career took off. But somehow his income never quite caught up to their expenses. What bothered me most wasn't the money. I could afford it, and I wanted to help my family. What bothered me was Mark's growing sense of entitlement and his increasing disrespect toward me. The grateful young man who used to thank me profusely for every bit of help had morphed into someone who acted like my financial support was his right rather than my choice. The warning signs had been building for months. Mark would interrupt me during conversation, contradict my opinions at family gatherings, and make snide comments about older generation, not understanding modern economics. When I'd share stories about building my business or offer advice based on experience, he'd roll his eyes or change the subject like my wisdom was worthless. Susan seemed caught in the middle, appreciating my help, but unwilling to challenge her husband's increasingly rude behavior. "That's just how Mark is," she'd say when I'd mention his attitude. "He's under a lot of pressure at work, but pressure doesn't excuse disrespect. And success in sales doesn't give someone license to treat their financial benefactor like a burden." The first major clash happened 6 months before Thanksgiving, during Emma's birthday party. I'd given her a beautiful necklace that had belonged to her grandmother Margaret. Explaining the family history and significance of the piece, Emma was delighted and immediately asked me to help her put it on, but Mark intervened with a comment that still stings. "Emma, that's too fancy for a little girl. Put it away until you're older and can appreciate antique jewelry." The dismissal wasn't just about the necklace. It was about my place in the family hierarchy. Mark was establishing himself as the decision-maker about what gifts were appropriate for my own granddaughter, overruling both Emma's excitement and my role as grandfather. When I tried to explain the sentimental value, he cut me off with, "I understand you mean well, Richard, but parents know what's best for their children." The disrespect escalated during family dinners, where Mark would monopolize conversations with stories about his sales victories while showing no interest in my experiences or opinions. When I'd mentioned challenges I'd faced building my business or lessons I'd learned over 40 years of entrepreneurship, Mark would politely nod and then immediately redirect the conversation back to his current projects. My decades of experience were being treated as irrelevant history. What hurt most was watching Susan gradually adopt Mark's dismissive attitude toward me. The daughter who used to call me for advice about everything from career decisions to parenting strategies started keeping me at arm's length. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Invitations to family events came with subtle suggestions about not staying too long or keeping things simple because Mark preferred smaller gatherings. The financial dynamic became increasingly uncomfortable as Mark's request for help grew more demanding and less grateful. Instead of asking if I could assist with expenses, he started informing me about payments that needed to be made. "The school tuition is due next week," he'd say, or "the car insurance renewal is coming up." No please, no thank you, just expectations that I would handle financial obligations for his family. Even the grandchildren started reflecting their father's attitude toward me. Emma and Jake, who used to light up when I visited, became more reserved and formal in our interactions. When I'd suggest activities we could do together, they'd look to Mark for approval, rather than responding with their previous enthusiasm. My role was being systematically diminished from beloved grandfather to tolerated elderly relative. The breaking point was building toward Thanksgiving, when Mark announced they were hosting dinner for immediate family only, meaning his parents were invited. But the guest list was being carefully controlled. The implication was clear. I was welcome as a financial contributor, but my presence as a person was merely tolerated. The man living in a house I'd helped purchase was treating me like an inconvenient obligation rather than family. During our last conversation before Thanksgiving, Mark actually had the audacity to suggest I should consider downsizing my lifestyle to focus more on family priorities, meaning redirect even more of my money toward their expenses. The irony was staggering. The man whose entire lifestyle depended on my generosity was lecturing me about financial priorities while living in luxury I was funding. Thanksgiving Day started normally enough, with me arriving at Susan and Mark's house carrying homemade rolls and a bottle of wine, looking forward to spending time with my grandchildren. The house looked beautiful, decorated with fall colors, and filled with the smell of turkey and all the traditional side dishes. Mark's parents, Linda and Bob Parker, were already there, and the atmosphere seemed pleasant and family-friendly. The conversation during cocktails was light and cheerful, focused on the kids' school activities, holiday plans, and general family updates. Emma showed me her latest art project, and Jake told me about his soccer team's winning season. For a brief moment, I felt like the valued grandfather and family patriarch I'd always hoped to be. The tension that had been building for months seemed temporarily forgotten. The trouble started during dinner when Bob Parker mentioned something about the election results and how younger generations understand politics better than older folks who are stuck in the past. It was a mildly provocative comment, but I responded with a gentle observation about how experience often provides valuable perspective on political cycles. Nothing controversial, nothing inflammatory, just a grandfather sharing his viewpoint with his family. Mark's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "That's exactly the problem with your generation, Richard," he said, his voice rising with sudden anger. "You think your outdated opinions matter more than facts. You don't understand how the modern world works, but you act like your age makes you wise, instead of just irrelevant." The hostility came out of nowhere, shocking everyone at the table. I tried to de-escalate by saying something about how different generations can learn from each other, but Mark was just getting started. "You know what? I'm tired of pretending your opinions are valuable just because you're older. This is 2023, not 1975. Your ideas about politics, business, even parenting are completely out of touch with reality." Susan looked mortified but said nothing to defend me. The final explosion came when I suggested we change the subject to keep things pleasant for the children. That's when Mark stood up from his chair and delivered the words that would cost him everything. "Leave, you're not welcome here anymore. This is my house and my family, and I don't want to hear your outdated opinions ruining our holiday dinner. Get out." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma started crying. Jake stared at his plate, and even Mark's parents looked shocked by their son's outburst. Susan finally spoke up, but instead of defending me, she said, "Mark, maybe that's a little harsh," which wasn't exactly a strong condemnation of her husband's behavior. The lack of support from my own daughter hurt almost as much as Mark's verbal assault. I stood up slowly, maintaining my dignity, despite the humiliation burning through me. "I see," I said quietly, looking around the table at faces that couldn't meet my eyes. "I'll gather my things and go." Nobody protested. Nobody asked me to stay. Nobody suggested that Mark was out of line for throwing a 68-year-old man out of their home on Thanksgiving Day. As I walked to the front door, I could hear Mark continuing his rant behind me. "Finally, maybe now we can have a normal family dinner without walking on eggshells around someone who thinks his age gives him the right to lecture everyone." The cruelty in his voice was shocking, but what shocked me more was the silence from everyone else at that table. That 30-minute drive home was the longest of my life, replaying the scene over and over and trying to understand how I'd become so unwelcome in my own daughter's family. But by the time I reached my house, hurt had transformed into clarity, and clarity had transformed into decisive action. Mark wanted his independence so badly, He was about to get more independence than he'd bargained for. I spent exactly 1 hour that Thanksgiving night feeling sorry for myself, sitting in my study and replaying the humiliation of being thrown out of my daughter's house. Then I opened my laptop and began systematically dismantling the financial web that had been supporting Mark and Susan's lifestyle for 8 years. The first call was to my bank's emergency line to freeze all joint accounts and stop all automatic transfers scheduled for the following day. The second call was to my financial advisor's emergency number, instructing him to cancel every credit card that had my name as a guarantor, close every line of credit I'd co-signed, and remove my backing from every loan or financial commitment connected to Mark and Susan's household. By midnight, I'd severed every financial tie that had been keeping their upper-middle-class lifestyle afloat. The third call was to my attorney's answering service, leaving a detailed message about needing to review and revoke every power of attorney, financial authorization, and legal document that gave Susan or Mark any access to my assets or accounts. I wanted every legal connection severed as completely as possible. The man who'd told me I wasn't welcome would discover exactly how unwelcome my money could become. Friday morning brought the first signs that my actions were having immediate consequences. Susan called 3 times before I finally answered, her voice panicked and confused. "Dad, something's wrong with the bank accounts. The mortgage payment bounced, and all our credit cards are being declined. There must be some kind of computer error." I let her explain the error for several minutes before calmly telling her exactly what I'd done. "There's no error, Susan," I said. "I removed my financial support from your household last night, just like Mark removed me from your family. You wanted independence from my outdated opinions? Congratulations, you now have complete independence from my outdated money, too." The silence on the other end of the phone told me she was finally understanding the full scope of what had just happened. The weekend brought a parade of increasingly frantic phone calls and text messages. Mark had apparently spent Saturday morning at the bank trying to understand why their accounts were frozen and their credit lines were closed. When he learned that I'd removed my financial backing, his messages went from confused to angry to desperate in record time. "You can't do this to us over one argument," he texted. "Think about Emma and Jake." But I was thinking about Emma and Jake specifically. I was thinking about how they'd watched their father humiliate their grandfather and learned that disrespect has no consequences. Now they were about to learn a different lesson entirely, that actions have prices, and sometimes those prices are higher than anyone expects to pay. By Sunday, the full reality was setting in. Without my financial support, Mark and Susan couldn't make their mortgage payment, couldn't pay the private school tuition, couldn't cover the car payments, and couldn't maintain the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to over 8 years. The house of cards I'd been propping up with my generosity was collapsing exactly as designed. Susan drove to my house Sunday evening, not to apologize for the Thanksgiving disaster, but to beg me to reconsider my financial decision. "Dad, please," she said, standing on my doorstep like a stranger, "we can work this out. Mark was wrong to say those things, but you're punishing the whole family for his mistake." The fact that she still saw Mark's behavior as just a mistake, rather than a fundamental lack of respect, told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing Mark and Susan, threatening legal action unless I restored their financial support. The letter claimed I had created a verbal contract of ongoing assistance, and that suddenly withdrawing support constituted elder financial abuse of my own grandchildren. The audacity was breathtaking. They were accusing me of abusing them by stopping my voluntary generosity. My attorney's response was swift and decisive. Within days, Mark and Susan received a comprehensive legal document outlining exactly how much money I'd provided over 8 years: $380,000 in house down payment, $192,000 in private school tuition, $78,000 in car payment, plus countless other expenses totaling nearly $700,000 in unrepaid gift. The letter made it clear that all support had been voluntary and could be withdrawn at any time for any reason. The week before Christmas brought the most pathetic attempt at reconciliation yet. Emma and Jake showed up at my door with a homemade card apologizing for their father's behavior and begging me to come back to the family. It was clearly orchestrated by Mark and Susan, using the children as emotional weapons to manipulate my feeling. The card was sweet, but the manipulation behind it was disgusting. I invited the children in for hot chocolate and had an honest conversation with them about respect, consequences, and the difference between love and money. I love you both very much, I told them, but love doesn't mean accepting disrespect from anyone, including family members. Your father made a choice about how to treat me, and now everyone has to live with the consequences of that choice. January brought the inevitable financial crisis Mark and Susan had been trying to avoid. Without my support, they couldn't maintain their mortgage payments, and the house went into foreclosure proceedings. The private school sent notices about unpaid tuition, and both children had to transfer to public school mid-year. Mark's luxury car was repossessed, forcing him to drive Susan's older vehicle while she took public transportation to work. The most satisfying development came when Mark's sales performance suffered dramatically due to stress and distraction from his financial problem. His company placed him on probation for missing quotas, and his confident, arrogant demeanor cracked under the pressure of actual financial responsibility. The man who'd lectured me about modern economics was discovering that pride doesn't pay mortgages. Susan found a part-time job at a department store, working retail for the first time in her adult life. The woman who'd been living off my generosity for 8 years was finally learning what financial independence actually required. When she called crying about how hard everything had become, I reminded her that millions of families manage these same challenges without rich fathers subsidizing their lifestyle. By March, they were forced to move out of the foreclosed house and into a small rental apartment in a much less desirable neighborhood. The children adapted better than their parents, making new friends and adjusting to public school. But Mark seemed broken by the loss of status and financial security he'd taken for granted. His social media posts, once full of bragging about sales victories and luxury purchases, became sporadic and subdued. The final piece of justice came when I decided to relocate to a retirement community in Florida, purchasing a beautiful condo near the beach and starting a new chapter of my life. I sent Susan my new address and phone number with a note. If you ever want to have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, I'm here. But I'm done being an ATM for people who treat me like a burden. The revelation that had taken months to sink in was finally complete. Mark and Susan had confused my love with my money, and when forced to choose between respecting me and keeping my financial support, they'd chosen neither. 6 months into my new life in Florida, I received a letter that made my decision to cut off support feel completely vindicated. It was from Mark, written in desperate, rambling handwriting, explaining that he'd lost his job and was facing bankruptcy. He'd begged for forgiveness and pleaded for me to resume financial support, promising that things would be different if I gave them another chance. The letter was signed by both Mark and Susan, but the desperation reeked through every word. I read the letter twice, set it aside for a week, and then wrote a response that would close this chapter of my life forever. Mark, I wrote, you told me I wasn't welcome in your house, and that it was your family, not mine. You were right. It is your family, and these are your consequences. Learn to live with both. I never sent the letter. Some messages are more powerful when they're delivered through silence. My new life in Sunrise Gardens has been everything I hoped retirement could be. Betty Coleman, a widow from Michigan who lives 3 doors down, has become a wonderful companion for beach walks, book club meetings, and exploring local restaurants. Frank Davis, a retired engineer who appreciates good conversation about business and life, has become the kind of friend I never had time to cultivate when I was busy funding someone else's ingratitude. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm happier and more financially secure now than I was when I was supporting Mark and Susan's lifestyle, without the constant drain of their expenses. My retirement investments have grown substantially, and I've been able to travel, pursue hobbies, and enjoy luxuries I'd been sacrificing to fund their private school tuition and mortgage payments. Turns out being selfish with my own money has been quite liberating. The most satisfying aspect of this whole experience has been discovering that my worth as a person was never actually tied to my ability to solve other people's financial problems. The friends I've made here value my conversation, my sense of humor, and my life experience, not my bank account balance. Being appreciated for who I am, rather than what I can provide, has been a revelation at 68 years old. I occasionally wonder how Mark and Susan are managing their new reality, but I don't wonder enough to inquire. They made their choice that Thanksgiving night when they chose Mark's pride over family respect. I made my choice the same night when I chose self-respect over enabling ungrateful behavior. We're all living with the consequences of our decisions, and I'm quite comfortable with mine. The lesson I learned from this experience is that generosity without gratitude is just enabling, and family relationships based on financial dependency aren't really family relationships at all. Tell me, friend, have you ever been taken for granted by people you were helping? Share your story in the comments below, and if this story reminded you that respect is something you teach people to give you, not something you buy with your generosity, go ahead and subscribe. I've got more stories about finding your worth when others try to diminish it, about choosing dignity over dysfunction, and about the beautiful freedom that comes when you stop funding other people's disrespect. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face the consequences of their own choices.